The man who fired me didn't even know my name, and 4 months later he was sitting in a room full of lawyers trying to figure out why the entire company suddenly couldn't legally do its job anymore. I didn't warn him. I didn't argue. I simply walked out with a cardboard box and let time reveal what he had just thrown away. My name is Clara Whitfield, and for 19 years I gave everything I had to a company called Meridian Bioformulations. I joined when I was 22, fresh out of university, full of energy and belief that the work I was stepping into actually mattered. Back then, Meridian wasn't just a business. It was a lifeline for people who had nowhere else to go. Patients who needed medications that didn't exist in standard form, children with rare conditions, elderly people whose bodies couldn't tolerate commercial drugs, families who depended on us to get things exactly right because there was no margin for error. 19 years sounds like a long time when you say it out loud, but when you live it, it disappears into routine and purpose. It becomes early mornings in sterile labs, late nights rechecking formulas, weekends sacrificed because a batch didn't meet standards and couldn't be released. It becomes knowing every system inside the building, not because someone trained you once, but because you helped build those systems piece by piece when things went wrong and needed fixing. I stayed through everything. Leadership changes, financial instability, moments when we weren't sure the company would survive another year. I stayed when others left for higher salaries and easier work. I stayed because I believed in what we were doing, and because I understood something many people didn't. In our field, mistakes don't show up as numbers on a spreadsheet. They show up in hospital beds. Then one Monday morning, everything changed, and it started with a man who walked into the building like it already belonged to him. His name was Damian Forsyth, late 30s, perfectly styled, always dressed like he was heading into a magazine photo shoot. He had the kind of confidence that comes from never having faced real consequences. He wasn't hired through a process. He didn't climb his way up. He married into the company. 8 months after becoming the CEO's son-in-law, he was suddenly our new chief operating officer. The transition was quiet, almost unsettling. One day, Patricia, the woman who had been CO for years and who had mentored me through some of the most difficult periods of my career, packed her desk without any announcement. The next morning, Damian was sitting in her office, her name gone from the door, replaced overnight like she had never existed. I remember asking HR if there had been a formal selection process. The answer I got was carefully neutral, almost rehearsed. The position had been filled internally. When I pointed out that he had no experience in pharmaceutical manufacturing, I was told his background was in hospitality management, as if running hotels somehow translated into overseeing medication production. The first all-staff meeting he led told me everything I needed to know. He spoke for nearly half an hour about growth, scaling, optimization, and efficiency. He used corporate language like it was a script he had memorized. What he didn't mention even once was patient safety, not accuracy, not regulatory compliance, not the fact that every product leaving our facility would end up inside someone's body. That omission wasn't accidental. It was a reflection of how he saw the company. Within weeks, he began pushing for a 40% increase in production output. The numbers looked impressive on paper, but anyone who understood our systems knew exactly what that kind of acceleration would do. It would strain clean room capacity, increase contamination risk, and force shortcuts in processes that were never designed to be rushed. One of our senior technicians, a man named Robert Hayes, who had been there even longer than me, raised those concerns directly in a meeting. He explained calmly that the proposed timeline introduced serious risks. Damian didn't argue with the data. He dismissed the mindset. He smiled and labeled it resistance to change, as if decades of experience were nothing more than negativity. That moment stayed with me, not because of what was said, but because of what it revealed. He wasn't interested in understanding the systems. He was interested in reshaping them to fit his assumptions. Over the next few months, the changes came faster. Reporting structures were altered, so quality assurance answered directly to him instead of technical leadership. Critical verification steps were removed because they slowed down production. Protocols that had been built after real incidents, safeguards created to prevent harm, were suddenly dismissed as unnecessary complexity. I had spent years developing some of those protocols alongside a brilliant scientist named Dr. Elena Parada. We had tested them, refined them, and aligned them with strict regulatory standards. They weren't theoretical. They were battle-tested systems designed to protect patients. To Damian, they were just obstacles. By September, I had submitted multiple formal concerns. Each one was acknowledged with polite, meaningless responses. My words were being recorded, but not heard. That distinction became painfully clear the morning I was called into his office. I still remember the exact time, because I had been in the middle of verifying a batch when the call came through. There's a certain feeling you get when something significant is about to happen, a quiet tension you can't quite explain. I carried that feeling with me as I walked down the corridor. His office looked different from the way Patricia had kept it. Where she had photos of her family, he had motivational prints about disruption and innovation. He didn't offer me a seat. He didn't need to. The conversation wasn't designed to be comfortable. He started with a phrase I had heard before and immediately recognized as a warning. What followed was a carefully structured explanation about organizational realignment, efficiency, and the need to adapt to a new operational model. My role, along with 2 others, was being eliminated. 19 years reduced to a paragraph. He handed me an envelope with my final entitlements and told me I could take the rest of the day to gather my belongings. There was no acknowledgement of what I had built, no curiosity about what I knew, no hesitation in removing someone who had helped shape the company's core systems. I asked him one question before I left. I asked if he had reviewed the intellectual property provisions in my original contract. He looked at me with mild confusion, then gave me a reassuring answer that everything had been handled properly. I didn't correct him. I didn't argue. I simply nodded, wished him a good morning, and walked out. Packing my desk took less than 10 minutes. A photo of my family, a plant I had kept alive for years, a mug that had followed me through countless late nights. Robert hugged me without saying a word. A few others said quiet goodbyes. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I understood something important. The moment you show someone your breaking point, they stop seeing your strength. I left the building at 10:48 in the morning with a box in my hands and nearly 2 decades of knowledge that no one had thought to ask about. What I didn't tell Damien, what I chose to let him discover on his own, was something that had existed long before I ever joined Meridian. Years earlier, during my university research, I had developed a methodology for stability testing in complex compounded medications. It addressed a gap in how small operations managed interactions between ingredients, especially in high-risk formulations. It was detailed, precise, and incredibly effective. Encouraged by my supervisor, I formalized the work and eventually filed a patent under my maiden name, Clara Bennett. When I joined Meridian, that methodology gradually became part of how we operated. It wasn't imposed. It was adopted because it worked. A few years into my time there, the company formally licensed the methodology from me. It was a professional agreement, renewed over time, and integrated deeply into our systems. It became part of everything, from batch verification to regulatory compliance. That license had an expiration date. 4 months after I was fired, it was set to end. I went home that day, sat in my garden, and thought carefully about what to do. This wasn't about revenge. I didn't want the company to fail. Too many people depended on its work, but I also couldn't ignore what had happened or the risks that were being introduced under new leadership. So I made a decision that was both simple and significant. I chose not to renew the license. Through my lawyer, I formally notified the company that the agreement would expire at the end of December, and that any continued use of the methodology without a new contract would be considered infringement. I included every piece of documentation, the patent, the original agreement, the renewals, everything they needed to understand exactly what was at stake. The response was immediate. Within days, their legal team began reaching out. Internally, there was confusion, then urgency, then something closer to panic as they realized how deeply the methodology was embedded in their operations. This wasn't a tool they could replace overnight. It was part of the foundation. I was told that during one meeting, Damien asked who Clara Bennett was. The silence that followed said more than any explanation could. Negotiations began in January. This time, the conversation was very different. The CEO himself was present along with legal representatives and a new technical director who clearly understood the gravity of the situation. We reached an agreement, one that reflected the true value of the work and included conditions I cared deeply about. The verification protocols that had been removed were reinstated as mandatory procedures. Safeguards were put back in place. Damien wasn't in that room. He resigned shortly afterward. I didn't celebrate his departure. It wasn't about winning. It was about restoring balance, about ensuring that the systems protecting patients were respected again. Months later, I was invited to speak at an industry conference. I stood in front of a room full of professionals and talked about something that had become very clear to me. Knowledge has value, but only if it's recognized. Systems exist for a reason, but only if people remember why they were built. After the talk, a young woman approached me and asked how I stayed calm through everything. I thought about it for a moment before answering honestly. Because it was never about me. It was about the work. Today, I continue to consult and develop new methodologies. My name is properly attached to everything I create, not out of ego, but out of understanding. Recently, I received a letter from a mother whose child depends on a compounded medication built on the system I designed. She wrote that her daughter has been stable for years now. That simple message meant more to me than any title or office ever could. Because in the end, that's what all of this was really about. Not power, not recognition, not even justice. Just getting it right when it mattered most and making sure that what you build cannot be erased by someone who never took the time to understand it.